Welcome to Counterpoint. I'm Tanya Granick-Allen. The Ontario election call is expected any day now, with voting taking place on June 2nd. This is Ontario's first election since COVID entered our world, and of course, many are trying to predict what the outcome will be, especially when you factor in mail-in ballots and plenty of advance voting days. But before we even head into the election, the Ontario PC government, led by Doug Ford, tabled their 2022 budget filled with all sorts of funding commitments, especially in healthcare and education. However, the deficit is expected to jump to $19.9 billion this fiscal year, and the government isn't planning to balance the books until 2027 to 2028. Not your typical Conservative budget, I guess, but it's an election year, so anything goes, right? So let's dive right in and see how the election is shaping up in light of the budget and other policy announcements. And joining me now for our regular Ontario election panel here on Counterpoint is Elliot Hughes, Senior Advisor with Summa Strategies and former advisor to Liberal Finance and Defence Ministers, and Yianni Macris, President at Lepanto Group and former Conservative staffer. Thank you both for joining me. So it's been a fun week. We had a budget release just before an election call. So maybe I'll start with you, Elliot. What were some of your key takeaways or some of the interesting things you saw in the budget?
Well, it seems Premier Ford is taking a page out of Justin Trudeau's playbook and is opening the spigots on the spending. As you mentioned in your opener, a bit of a different budget approach than previous Conservative governments. You've got spending for many years to come, $20 billion almost this year in deficits, and you won't be returning to no deficits until 26, 27. So a different sort of tact there for sure. But I think, as you again pointed out, it's an election year, and so you want to make your voters happy. The big thing that jumped out for me was the focus on drivers. A couple months ago, the Ford government got rid of the license renewal fee. Those who live in Ontario got the money, the check in the mail. Mm-hmm. There was also some announcements around highways, and then they were going to take a look. The government said they're going to take a look at auto insurance as well. So a big focus on drivers. To me, that says suburbs. To me, that's 905. That's where Premier Ford wants to gain some seats, and he's going right after them with some pocketbook issues.
So that's where he wants to gain, or that's where he wants to keep the seats?
Both, I think. I think he realizes he needs to keep them. I think he's got a bit of a challenge when it comes to a lot of members are retiring, which is an interesting element to all this that we might be able to talk about today or another show, but certainly something to watch for in the coming weeks. Okay.
Yianni, what were your key takeaways from this budget?
Well, I don't think it was necessarily a take out of Justin Trudeau's playbook. I think it's more so a take from Stephen Harper's playbook. We saw with his in 2008, Stephen Harper was facing, global economic crisis, much similar to what we're facing today with the post-pandemic recovery. So I think this is Ford's plan as to how he wants to come out of the pandemic, how he wants to continue his campaign, I guess, slogan of being the yes premier, and that's why we're seeing investments into highways, into infrastructure, and trying to make life more affordable, like Elliot said, for drivers, for the average person in the 905 and GTA.
Yeah, well, it's a good point. I mean, most Ontarians do own a vehicle, and regardless about the carbon tax that keeps going up and the cost of gas and whatnot, it doesn't look like people will not own vehicles. So that seems like a very strategic move to go after that. What about, and I'll ask you, Yianni, first, what about some of the education and healthcare funding? How have we seen improvements in that with this budget?
Well, I think first and foremost, year over year, the Ford government has invested more than what the Wynne government and previous governments had done with respect to healthcare and education. And I mean, there's over $40 billion allocated in this budget just to hospitals and healthcare alone, not to mention an additional $21 billion for schools. So I think it's something that, isn't necessarily expected from a Conservative government to have such high amounts of money going into those specific sectors where, Liberals would like to say that Conservatives make, unprecedented cuts to both of those sectors. But I think it's interesting to see that you're seeing an increase in funding to those sectors.
Elliot, we have 30 seconds before commercial. Do you want to respond to any of that, especially on the education file?
Yeah, the pandemic exposed some of the cracks we have in the education system. Ontario's was not spared from that. I think the Ford government understands that it's an important part of families' lives. What more important is there than the education of young people? And so that those investments reflect that. But to Yianni's point, this is still not normal ground for the Tories, and so we'll see whether or not voters buy it in the next couple of weeks.
Okay, we're going to pick this up in just a few moments. Welcome back. We're discussing the soon-to-be-called Ontario election, the voting day, the main results and voting day taking place June 2nd. And joining me again is Elliot Hughes and Yianni Macris. Elections Ontario, which is the governing body that oversees the election, the provincial election, has made some interesting changes or brought in some new measures to help perhaps gain confidence of voters to maybe encourage more voting. Elliot, why don't you walk us through some of these changes and how you think they might impact the results or the voters?
Yeah, well, I guess starting off, I think anything that we can do to make voting easier and more accessible and to encourage democracy, for me, is a good thing. And so I see some of the steps that Elections Ontario are taking as very positive. So extending advanced polling days, I think they're doubling them from 5 to 10 days. That's a good thing. I think they're looking to really get their mail-in ballot process quite formalized and quite tight to be able to respond to what is expected to be, I would imagine, an increase if it follows any of the trends from the federal election that we had last year. To me, these are all good, positive steps. We should make it easier for people to vote, whether it's sort of easier for elderly or whatever the case is. So I'm encouraged by the steps that Elections Ontario is taking. It'll be interesting to see if we do see the same kind of pickup on mail-in ballots, or has the pandemic sort of passed people by, or at least we've gotten over the pandemic where people feel much more comfortable returning to an indoor setting, in-person voting.
Okay, Yianni, your take on these new measures?
I think the first big point that stood out to me from Elections Ontario was the fact that voters can now register on their phones through their apps and to receive voting information not by mail as we have traditionally, but through a text message notification or through an email, which I think really speaks to the younger demographic that generally doesn't show up to vote as often as those in the 30 plus bracket. So that's one thing that really stood out to me. But I think my biggest concern with this whole mail-in ballot thing was, 1.2 million Canadians in the federal election in 2021 had requested mail-in ballots, and of that, 205,000 went uncounted. So what does that mean for Ontario? I don't know. I think Elections Ontario is probably working with Elections Canada to see where their shortcomings were, and certainly is working to avoid making the same mistakes.
So I remember that time about the mail-in ballots, because that was in, I don't know, the fourth wave of COVID, I think. And during that time, I remember there was a lot of hoopla about, or a lot of noise being made about how we had this robust program. There would be a lot of opportunities for these mail-in ballots. The process seemed a little bit complicated and onerous. But there was a lot of effort made to I guess, enfranchise people, to get them engaged. But then you're right, there were a couple 100,000 that were simply not counted, which is sad because, in certain races, I'm sure that could have been made the decision in certain races, who knows. My concern when it comes down to mail-in ballot, and why I always prefer voting in person, and I always have, is I like the identification verification. There seems to be less room for voter fraud. And whether we like it or not, voter fraud exists. It happens in every election. Maybe not to the degree that it happens south of the border in some of the counties in America, but we do have voter fraud. So my concerns are what kind of measures will be put in place with mail-in ballots to ensure that the right person who's allowed to vote is actually voting. Any thoughts on that, Elliot?
Well, I would say that there is very, 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 very low voter fraud in Canada. I would just make that abundantly clear. It's just something that, if it does happen, it in no way, shape, or form impacts the outcome of any races. Now, with that said, I do take your point that verifying ID is hugely important, whether it's in person or mail-in, or in the mail-in format. I think Elections Ontario is probably, as Yianni said, learning from the federal election and improving some of their processes. And so, this can always be improved. We can always improve. We can always improve our processes when it comes to mail-in. I think that we can always improve our processes for in-person as well. Make
Absolutely.
it easier to vote, shorter lines, and that's what I think Elections Ontario is trying to do here: is make it easier for more people to vote over a longer period of time, so we get more engagement.
Yes, and I really appreciate them doubling the amount of advanced polling days because, let's face it, not everybody's available on a specific day. So that's a very good measure. We're going to head to commercial in just a few moments. The reason we're talking about an increase in mail-in ballots rather, is because, we've just kind of come out of COVID, and there are many Canadians who are still, or many Ontarians rather, who are still very concerned about coming in person. And I want to talk about some of the opposition parties who are suggesting that, how we can navigate this election in the shadow of COVID. And we're going to talk about that in just a few moments when we return. One of the wonderful things I love of election time is I feel like there's more issue debate in this period. I think people are more focused, we get more engagement, and it's wonderful. It's a great exercise in democracy. I love it. So one thing I like to do is always see what the opposition is saying. And we've seen with the Liberals and the NDP, there has been a lot of criticisms levied at the Ford government for not doing too much or not funding enough with healthcare during COVID, not enough to help us overcome COVID, or as you've both probably mentioned, that there have been some cracks exposed because of COVID and how we should have cemented those earlier. How much of a role do you really think COVID will play in this election cycle? Do you think, Elliot, you mentioned that you think that maybe there might be fatigue over it and people have kind of moved on. Is that still the sentiment?
I think so, but again, we're going to have to wait and see how the population and the voters react. Look, I think what the Liberals are going to want to try and do is remind voters, and the NDP as well for that matter, remind voters that some of the darker days of COVID, of the pandemic, the inability of the Ford government to get the federal dollars into schools or to get it into the healthcare system, some of the challenges in long-term care homes. Those are the types of things I think that the opposition are going to try and highlight, and the sort of the mismanagement or the failings of management from the Ford government at the time. It was a difficult time to manage, to be in power. I think any government struggled through it in some capacity. I think the opposition parties, to the degree of bringing up COVID, I think that's going to be the lens in which they're going to do it in.
And Yianni, do you think the Ford government could weather that storm? I mean, a wise man once told me that politics is all about it's the reminding business. You're in the business of reminding people, oh, do you remember that? Do you remember when this happened? And I can see that the opposition's, the two parties will want to remind voters, oh, do you remember, when that report came out damning the actions in the LTCs and the failings there? Do you think Doug Ford and his team are going to have to wear that? And do you think people have just had enough and are ready to move on?
I think Ford recognizes that that people have had enough with COVID and they want to move on. Whether or not he can weather the storm, I think it's going to be a testament to post-pandemic elections at this point. The only election that we've really seen aside from Nova Scotia, it has been the federal election, and Justin Trudeau wore the cape really well and represented the fact that, he stood up for Canada during a time of crisis. Now, is Ford going to do the same thing? I certainly think so. I would hope so. But the extent of that, the effect that would have on Ontarians is going to be something that we're going to have to see just on election day. Now,
Yianni, another issue that I could say for the last few election cycles was quite prominent was climate change. What role does it play, what the government response has been, and so on and so forth. There has been some suggestion that, looking at this budget that was just released recently, the Ontario budget, and looking at some of the policies the parties are bringing up, there seems to be not as much being said about climate change. Do you think this is true? And if so, what's your reasoning behind it, do you think?
You know what? I think it's because, the number one issue we saw in the 2021 election was that the number one issue facing Canadians is affordability. I think Canadians are much more concerned about the amount of money that they're paying at the pump to fill up their car with gas to get to and from work or to drop their kids off at school, as opposed to, what measures the government is taking to ensure that oil and gas development in Canada is stifled. I certainly think that, there are, while climate change is certainly an important issue, the number one issue top of mind for myself, for my family, for my parents and friends and others is whether or not they can afford to pay their bills and to be able to put food on the table.
So, Elliot, I'll come to you now. Do you think affordability or other issues for that matter have now eclipsed climate change, and this will be perhaps one of the first elections in recent memory where it will barely get mentioned?
Yeah, it sure feels like it, doesn't it? I mean, affordability seems to be all around us, whether it's the gas prices, whether it's the housing challenges, you name it, it's everywhere. And that makes it difficult for other issues to emerge. I would suggest, though, that this is an opportunity for some leadership. This is a big issue. It's going to continue to be a very big issue. And it's an opportunity for the Liberals and the NDP to seize on that. And I think to drive it home with certain segments of voters that this current Ford government just isn't serious about the environment, isn't serious about climate change, and to really see if they can motivate some of their base, I'm thinking younger people, folks who live in cities, to see that as a really important issue for themselves and for their families. It'll be interesting to see how much the opposition parties are able to talk about it. A lot of the times on campaigns, it's the governing party, what they do and how the opposition parties react. So if they're not talking about the climate or the environment, it's very difficult for the opposition to make that connection.
Welcome back to our panel on the Ontario election. It's just a few weeks away. It'll be on June 2nd is when the results will be released, will be election day. Of course, many advanced polling dates before then. Let's talk about some of the policy announcements from the opposition. Elliot, I take your point well that usually it's the governing party that sort of sets the tone in the election. But, there have been some interesting announcements coming from the Liberals and the NDP, even the Greens to some degree. So why don't you explain, for example, I noticed recently, the Liberals announced a very interesting tax cut on prepared food. Please share with us and why you think that could have an impact.
Yeah, for the Liberals, they want to be fighting on the side of the little guy and sort of working families and so being seen as supporting working families. And that's a bit of a rebrand, I would say, from the Liberals from the previous Wynne government. So it's going to take a bit of time, and we'll see whether or not the leader in Stephen Del Duca can actually deliver that message. But things like cutting taxes on prepared foods, like directly targeting sort of working families, people who rely on prepared foods a lot more. And I think that's an important idea. But another one that came out, I think just either today or in the last couple of days, is this idea of being able to use public transit for a buck a ride. And it speaks a little bit to the buck a beer previous commitment from the Ford government, but sort of turns it on its head. It's also a good way for them to be talking about environment and climate change, just like we were talking about, being able to change the channel in a catchy way, and is a direct contrast to Ford's focus on highways and drivers and so on. So these policy announcements speak to, I think, the type of voters that the Liberals want to go after. It's the same thing with the NDP. They're really focusing in on who do we need to motivate to get to the polls so that we can bring out our voters and hopefully win some of those key seats for us.
Yes, it sounds like the Liberals are really going to target the 416, where obviously the Conservatives made some gains in the last election, specifically on the Scarborough and the Etobicoke. Usually it's all painted red. So we will see if that will make an impact. But interesting, a buck a ride, that's definitely appealing to the urban voter. Yianni, what policies have you seen released from some of the opposition parties that caught your eye?
One thing that I think caught my eye by great surprise was, what Andrea Horwath put out the other day, who's proposing to expand pharmacare, dental care, and mental health care. I mean, policies that, we would expect from the NDP, but they would freeze provincial income taxes on households with incomes of up to $200,000. That's something that, I certainly don't expect coming from the NDP, mainly because they seem to think that usually anyone making less than or more than $80,000 is considered the 1%, who are the big bad, tax evaders who are the reason why government services are falling apart and why, there's a lean towards privatization. But, something like that from the NDP is certainly surprising, and I think quite wise, especially when most people can understand that today, making $100,000 isn't like making $100,000 10 years ago.
So do you think the NDP is trying to rebrand itself as being more, taking up more of the center, wanting to hold on to that coveted opposition position? I mean, I don't see that they are going to win this election cycle. It doesn't look that way by looking at the polls, but they want to hang on to that opposition position, perhaps?
100%. You know what? I mean, they're looking. Their number one enemy right now isn't Doug Ford. It's Stephen Del Duca and the Liberal Party of Ontario. They know that the Liberals are a lot more open now to more left-wing ideas that the NDP championed in previous elections and decades. So I think it's just kind of a not necessarily a rebrand, but more of a shift as to who their main target is in this election.
So it definitely will be an interesting election, and I'll let you have the last word, Elliot. The last election, there was a lot of anti-Kathleen Wynne sentiment, and it was kind of really voting Kathleen Wynne out. This time, it's, do we really want Doug to stay? Do we want Premier Ford to be our premier, or do we want something different? So there's less of that kind of sentiment. We have 30 seconds, but knowing that it seems that the NDP is weakening its support and the Liberals stand to benefit, what will that mean for the Tories? 25 seconds.
Well, I think the Tories are in pretty good shape going this election, I must say. I think the challenge is going to be with Andrea Horwath and the NDP. She's been around for a couple of election cycles, and I think voters are getting a little perhaps tired of her leadership and her style of leadership. When the Liberals were in power for 15 years, Kathleen Wynne sort of obviously wore that. This is a new Liberal Party. It's trying to brand itself as a new Liberal Party with new types of policies. We'll see if that works over the next couple of weeks.
Okay, well, thank you both so much for your time today. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Tanya.
Thank you.
Well, with the NDP bringing themselves closer to the right with some of their policies and perhaps the Liberals going a little bit further to the left, one has to wonder, well, what does that mean and where would the Conservatives fit into all of this? Well, we have a few more weeks to the election, so we'll see what happens. For Counterpoint, I'm Tanya Granick-Allen.